The message arrived on a Tuesday morning, encrypted with codes that Lisa Martinez had never seen before. She sat in the science lab of the human research vessel Endeavour, watching the text appear on her screen with growing disbelief. The words were simple, but their meaning was devastating. All human personnel were to evacuate council space within 72 hours. No exceptions, no delays, no explanations. Captain Jake Sullivan burst into the lab moments later, his face pale and drawn. He had received the same message from Earth Command, along with orders that made his stomach turn. Every human colony, every research station, every diplomatic outpost was to be abandoned immediately. 40 years of cooperation with the Galactic Council had ended in a single transmission. "This has to be a mistake," Dr. Alex Johnson said when Jake called the senior staff together. The xenobiologist had spent the last 3 years working with the Kalari people, trying to find a cure for the plague that was slowly killing their species. His research was so close to success that he could almost taste it. "We're days away from a breakthrough. The Kalari children are counting on us." Jake looked around the room at his crew. These people had devoted their lives to helping others across the galaxy. Lisa had developed water purification systems that saved millions of lives on desert worlds. Alex had created medical treatments for diseases that had puzzled alien doctors for centuries. Engineer Pete Collins had designed atmospheric processors that turned dead worlds into gardens. Now they were all being told to pack up and leave like criminals fleeing justice. The communication from Earth Command was clear but cold. There would be no negotiations, no appeals, no second chances. The Galactic Council had voted unanimously to expel humanity from all territories under their control. The reasons were classified, but the result was final. Every human had 3 days to leave or face arrest as illegal aliens. On the planet below, the Kalari medical team worked frantically in their laboratories. Dr. Shenga had learned more about biochemistry in 3 years with the humans than in 30 years of traditional education. The cure for the plague was within reach, hidden somewhere in the complex molecular structures that Alex had been mapping. But without human expertise, the research might as well have been written in an ancient dead language. Lisa began the heartbreaking task of shutting down her projects. The water treatment facility on Proxima 4 would fail within months without human maintenance. The agricultural systems on New Vorthen relied on technology that only human engineers understood. Dozens of worlds would suffer when the humans were gone, but the orders were absolute. Ambassador Kate Williams stood in her office on Nexus Prime, the massive space station that served as the Council's headquarters. She had spent 15 years building relationships with alien diplomats, creating trust between species that had been enemies for centuries. Her desk was covered with reports of successful peacekeeping missions, trade agreements that brought prosperity to struggling worlds, and humanitarian projects that had saved countless lives. She gathered these reports into a single file and walked slowly to the council chambers. The great hall was empty except for cleaning drones that hummed quietly as they prepared for the next session. Kate placed the file on the central podium where she had once addressed the assembled representatives of 200 worlds. The document contained everything humanity had done for the galaxy, every life saved, every crisis resolved, every gift freely given. The file lay there like an accusation, thick with evidence of human contributions that were about to be dismissed forever. Kate walked away without looking back, her footsteps echoing in the vast emptiness of the chamber. Across the galaxy, human families packed their belongings with heavy hearts. Children who had been born on alien worlds asked their parents why. They had to leave their friends behind. Scientists destroyed years of research rather than let it fall into hands that might misuse it. Doctors said goodbye to patients they might never see again. The evacuation was orderly but painful. Human ships arrived at colonies and research stations, loading people and essential equipment with military efficiency. Personal items were left behind, homes abandoned, gardens allowed to grow wild. 40 years of human presence in council space was being erased in 3 short days. On some worlds, alien friends came to say goodbye. They brought gifts and promises to stay in touch, though everyone knew that communication would be impossible once the humans left council space. The Centaurian musician Zaranel wept as she hugged her human colleagues at the cultural exchange center. The massive Kron laborers who had worked alongside human engineers stood silently as the transport ships departed, their huge hands raised in farewell. But not everyone was sad to see the humans go. Counselor Vexka of the Zephyrian hegemony watched the evacuation from his observation deck with satisfaction. The humans had been a disruption from the moment they joined the council, always pushing for changes, always interfering in matters that were none of their business. Their ideas about individual rights and democratic governance were dangerous to the young. Established order. The last human transport lifted off from council space exactly 72 hours after the evacuation order was given. Captain Sullivan watched his homeworld of New Terra disappear behind them, knowing he would never see it again. The colony his grandfather had founded was now just another dot of light in the vast darkness of space. Dr. Johnson tried to transmit his research data to the Kalari medical team, but the council had already blocked all human communications. His life's work was trapped in computer files that might as well have been buried on a dead world. The cure for the Kalari plague would die with the human exodus, and millions would suffer for it. Ambassador Williams sent one final message to the council before her ship left Nexus Prime. It was brief and professional, thanking the council for 40 years of cooperation and wishing them success in their future endeavors. She did not mention the growing list of crises that would soon overwhelm the galaxy without human assistance. She did not warn them about the consequences of their decision. She simply said goodbye and cut the transmission. The human fleet gathered at the edge of council space like refugees fleeing a war zone. Millions of people floated in the darkness between stars, uncertain of their future but determined to survive. They had been cast out from the only home many of them had ever known, branded as unwelcome despite 4 decades of faithful service. As the last human ship crossed the boundary into neutral space, the galaxy seemed to sigh with relief. The council's computers automatically updated their records, removing humanity from the list of member species. Trade agreements were canceled, research partnerships dissolved, humanitarian missions abandoned. It was as if humans had never existed at all. But in the silence that followed their departure, something vital was missing. The galaxy had lost more than just another species. It had lost its conscience, its helping hand, its voice for the voiceless. The humans had left without protest or violence, fading away like whispers in the wind. Only time would reveal the true cost of their absence, and by then it would be far too late to call them back. 3 months had passed since the last human ship vanished beyond the rim of council space, and the great hall of Nexus Prime buzzed with celebration. The assembled representatives of 200 worlds had gathered to hear Council Prime Vex Tal address the success of their bold decision. The ancient hegemony leader stood at the central podium, his crystalline form catching the light as he spoke to the eager crowd. Fellow beings of the galaxy, Vex Tal began, his voice carrying clearly through the translation systems. We have taken a necessary step to preserve the natural order of civilized space. The human disruption has ended, and we can now return to the proven ways that have served us for millennia. The crowd murmured its approval. Many of the older species remembered the galaxy before humans arrived with their strange ideas and aggressive expansion. Those had been simpler times, when each species knew its place and kept to its own territory. The humans had changed everything, with their restless energy and uncomfortable questions about justice and equality. Nira Shan of the Crystalline Collective rose to support the Prime's words. Her species had always valued order and tradition above all else, and the humans had threatened both with their constant push for reform. The human contamination of our pure systems has been cleansed, she announced. No longer will our young people be poisoned by dangerous concepts like individual rights and democratic governance. The Zephyrian delegate, Vexka, nodded vigorously from his seat. His own homeworld had been struggling with protests and civil unrest ever since human diplomats had suggested that ordinary citizens should have a voice in their government. The humans called it democracy, but Vexka knew it was really chaos disguised as progress. Without human influence, his people would return to the peaceful obedience they had shown for thousands of years. Let us remember, Vextal continued, the crimes that led to this necessary expulsion. The humans were too aggressive in their expansion, claiming worlds and establishing colonies at a rate that threatened the careful balance we have maintained. They interfered constantly in the internal affairs of other species, imposing their values on cultures that had no need for change. The crowd shifted uncomfortably as some remembered the human peacekeeping missions that had ended bloody conflicts on their worlds. But those memories were pushed aside as Vextal listed more accusations. The humans had shared technology too freely, disrupting the natural development of younger species. They had questioned ancient treaties and traditional hierarchies. They had even suggested that all sentient beings deserved equal treatment under galactic law. Such radical thinking could only lead to destruction, the Prime declared. We have saved ourselves from chaos and preserved the order that has kept peace in our galaxy for centuries. In the back of the Great Hall, Peter Chun sat quietly and tried to keep his expression neutral. He was one of the few humans who had chosen to remain in council space, having married a Centauran diplomat named Zaranel. His special status as a family member of a council citizen allowed him to stay, but his position as a junior analyst gave him access to information that troubled his sleep. Peter's job was to monitor humanitarian crises across the galaxy and coordinate relief efforts. In the 3 months since the human exodus, his workload had tripled. The Caleri plague was spreading beyond all containment efforts. The Vorthan food crisis had escalated from serious to catastrophic. The civil war on Proxima 7 had exploded into system-wide violence without human peacekeepers to mediate the conflict. But when Peter tried to include these developments in his reports, his supervisors told him to focus on positive news instead. The council wanted to hear about stability and order, not about growing problems that might suggest the decision had been wrong. So Peter kept his observations to himself and watched the crisis reports pile up on his desk like accusations. His wife Zaranel noticed his distress, but couldn't understand his concerns. She was a career diplomat who had always resented human influence in council affairs. The galaxy managed perfectly well before humans arrived, she reminded him when he tried to explain his worries. These temporary disruptions will settle down once everyone adjusts to the new reality. Peter wanted to show her the data he had discovered while researching historical patterns. Before humans joined the council, the average galactic conflict lasted 40% longer and claimed twice as many lives. Interspecies cooperation had been at historic lows, with most species viewing their neighbors as potential threats rather than partners. The humans had changed all that with their strange insistence on treating everyone as equals. Peter knew better than to share such information with his wife. Zaranel was loyal to the council first and to him second. If she knew what he was thinking, she might report his dangerous thoughts to the security services. So he smiled and agreed that everything would work out for the best. While privately watching the galaxy tear itself apart, the celebration in the council chambers continued late into the station's artificial night. Representatives gave speeches about the return to traditional values and the end of human contamination. They toasted the wisdom of their leaders and the bright future that awaited them all. Wine flowed freely, and laughter echoed through halls that had once hosted human ambassadors pleading for peace and cooperation. Counselor Vexka found himself surrounded by admirers who praised his role in the expulsion vote. He had been one of the strongest voices calling for human removal, arguing that their presence weakened the authority of established governments. "Mark my words," he told the crowd, "within a year we will wonder how we ever tolerated their interference. The galaxy will be stronger without them." The hegemony's military attaché agreed enthusiastically. "Human peacekeepers were always getting in the way of proper conflict resolution," he said. "Now disputes can be settled the traditional way, through strength and determination. The weak will learn their place, and the strong will maintain order." Few of the celebrating delegates noticed that several seats in the Great Hall remained empty. The Kalari representative had not attended, too busy dealing with the plague that was consuming his homeworld. The Vorthan delegate was absent as well, desperately trying to prevent mass starvation among his people. The representative from Proxima 7 had been killed in the civil war that was tearing his system apart, but these absences were explained away as temporary inconveniences. The Council's propaganda services assured everyone that these minor problems would resolve themselves once the natural order was restored. The humans had created dependencies that would take time to overcome, but strength and tradition would ultimately prevail over artificial assistance. As the celebration wound down, Vextal stood once more at the podium to deliver his closing remarks. "Today marks the beginning of a new age," he declared. "An age free from human interference, guided by the wisdom of our ancestors and the strength of our convictions. We have chosen the path of independence over dependence, tradition over innovation, order over chaos." The crowd rose to its feet in thunderous applause, convinced that they had made the greatest decision in galactic history. They believed they had saved civilization itself from human corruption. None of them suspected that they had actually signed its death warrant, condemning billions of beings to suffer and die in conflicts that human wisdom might have prevented. The celebration ended with fireworks that lit up the space around Nexus Prime, brilliant explosions of light that faded quickly into darkness. It was a fitting symbol for the Council's triumph, beautiful and brief, followed by a silence that would soon be filled with screams. Ben Taylor stared at the shipping manifests spread across his desk and felt his stomach drop. As supply coordinator for the Independent Trade Federation, he was used to seeing complex patterns in cargo movements across the galaxy. But the numbers in front of him told a story that made no sense, unless something terrible was happening to the galactic supply chain. Medical supplies to quarantine zones had dropped by 78% over the past 6 months. Emergency relief shipments to disaster areas had virtually disappeared. The sophisticated logistics network that kept humanitarian aid flowing to where it was needed most seemed to have collapsed overnight. Ben had seen supply disruptions before, but nothing like this systematic breakdown of essential services. He pulled up the historical data and began tracing the problem back to its source. The decline had started exactly 6 months ago, right after the human exodus from Council space. That couldn't be a coincidence, but Ben couldn't understand the connection. Humans had never been the galaxy's primary suppliers of medical equipment or emergency supplies. Most of that production came from the industrial worlds of the core systems. The truth became clear when Ben dug deeper into the shipping records. The humans hadn't been supplying the goods, but they had been managing the distribution. Their computer systems had tracked every crisis, calculated optimal shipping routes, and coordinated with local authorities to ensure supplies reached the right places at the right time. Without human oversight, the relief network had become a chaotic mess of missed deliveries and bureaucratic confusion. Ben tried to bring this discovery to his supervisors, but they were too busy celebrating increased profits to listen. With human Competition eliminated. The major shipping companies were charging higher rates and taking fewer risks. Dangerous routes to plague worlds and disaster zones were simply abandoned as unprofitable. The Trade Federation Board saw this as smart business, not humanitarian catastrophe. On Kalari Prime, Dr. Shenva watched helplessly as the plague spread beyond anything her people had ever experienced. The human research team had been so close to a breakthrough, working with molecular structures that seemed to hold the key to salvation. But the complex biochemical models they had been developing might as well have been written in an alien language. Shenvei and her colleagues had tried desperately to continue the human research, but they lacked the theoretical framework to understand what Alex Johnson and his team had been doing. The humans had a different way of thinking about disease and treatment, approaching problems from angles that Kalari science had never considered. Without that perspective, the cure remained tantalizingly out of reach. The plague victims filled hospitals beyond capacity. Children who might have been saved with human medical intervention died in overcrowded wards. Families watched their loved ones waste away, while the cure sat locked in computer files that no one could decode. The Kalari government sent desperate messages to the council begging for help, but the response was always the same. The humans were gone, and the galaxy would have to learn to manage without them. Captain Morris Adams received the distress call while his independent freighter-free Spirit was hauling grain to the Centauri colonies. The message came from asteroid station Gamma 7, where 12,000 miners and their families worked in the dangerous business of extracting rare metals from the system's asteroid belt. Their atmospheric processors were failing, and toxic gases were building up throughout the station. Morris knew the problem immediately. The backup life support systems on Gamma 7 were human-designed and required specific maintenance protocols that only human engineers understood. The station's alien crew had been trying to fix them for weeks, but they lacked the technical knowledge to work with human technology. Without proper repairs, everyone on the station would suffocate within days. Morris changed course immediately and pushed his ship's engines to their limits. He wasn't a trained engineer, but he had worked on human ships long enough to understand the basics of their atmospheric systems. Maybe he could jury-rig something to buy the station more time while they waited for proper rescue ships to arrive. But when Morris reached the coordinates where Gamma 7 should have been, he found only empty space and scattered debris. The station had imploded when its atmospheric processors finally failed completely. 12,000 people had died because no one knew how to maintain the human technology that kept them alive. The official council report listed it as an unfortunate industrial accident caused by poor maintenance and operator error. There was no mention of the desperate calls for human technical assistance that had been ignored by council bureaucrats. The mining guild quietly added Gamma 7 to the growing list of facilities that would need to be abandoned or completely rebuilt. With non-human technology, Morris began keeping his own records of similar incidents. The pattern was becoming clear to anyone willing to look. Across the galaxy, critical systems designed or maintained by humans were beginning to fail. Power plants went offline, transportation networks broke down, communication arrays went silent. Each individual failure could be explained away as coincidence or poor planning, but together they painted a picture of systematic collapse. The Council's response was to ban the import or repair of human technology throughout their territory. Any equipment bearing human design signatures was to be replaced with approved alternatives as soon as possible. This policy was presented as a security measure to prevent human sabotage, but its real effect was to accelerate the breakdown of essential infrastructure. Peter Chun watched these developments from his position in the Council's Humanitarian Monitoring Office and felt his world crumbling around him. The crisis reports, crossing his desk, painted a picture of unprecedented suffering across the galaxy. Diseases, that human medicine could have controlled were running wild. Conflicts that human diplomats might have resolved were escalating into full-scale wars. Environmental disasters that human technology could have prevented were destroying entire ecosystems. But when Peter tried to include these patterns in his official reports, his supervisors edited out anything that might suggest the human exodus had been a mistake. The council wanted to hear about stability and progress, not about growing chaos that contradicted their narrative of success. So Peter learned to write 2 versions of every report, one for his bosses and one for his private files. His wife, Zeranil, grew increasingly concerned about his behavior. Peter had become withdrawn and moody, spending long hours staring at data files that seemed to bring him no joy. She tried to interest him in social activities with other diplomatic families, but he always found excuses to avoid them. When she asked what was troubling him, he would just shake his head and change the subject. The truth was that Peter couldn't bear to socialize with people who celebrated humanity's expulsion while the galaxy burned around them. His colleagues spoke proudly of their role in maintaining council security, while ignoring the mounting evidence that their security was an illusion. They praised the return to traditional values, while those values proved inadequate to address modern challenges. On the Outer Rim, conflicts that had been contained by human peacekeepers began to spiral out of control. The civil war on Proxima. 7 spread to neighboring systems as refugees carried their grievances across interstellar borders. Ancient territorial disputes that human diplomats had mediated for decades suddenly erupted into open warfare when the mediators were no longer available. The Council's military forces tried to fill the gap left by human peacekeepers, but they lacked the training and experience to handle complex multi-species conflicts. Their heavy-handed approach often made situations worse, turning local disputes into regional crises. The traditional military solution of crushing the weaker side might have worked in ancient times, but it was poorly suited to the interconnected galaxy that humans had helped create. Morris Adams documented each new catastrophe in his growing file of preventable disasters. He began to realize that the humans hadn't just been helpful neighbors in the galactic community. They had been the community's immune system, responding quickly to threats and healing wounds before they could fester. Without them, the galaxy was like a body fighting disease with no way to heal itself. The Free Spirit became an unofficial rescue ship, racing from crisis to crisis in a futile attempt to help where the Council would not. Morris and his small crew saved lives where they could, but they were just one ship against an ocean of need. For every person they helped, 1,000 others suffered in silence, while the galaxy's leaders insisted that everything was going according to plan. 1 year after the human exodus, the galaxy was drowning in blood and chaos. Commander Lisa Foster stood on the bridge of her ship at the edge of Council space, monitoring the flood of desperate communications that poured across the border like screams in the night. Her small observation post was officially neutral territory, but it had become an unofficial listening station for a galaxy tearing itself apart. The latest transmission came from the hegemony's core systems, where a massive stellar engineering project had gone catastrophically wrong. The humans had begun the project decades ago, carefully stabilizing an aging star to extend its life and protect the 3 inhabited worlds that depended on its warmth. But the Council had confidently taken over the operation 8 months ago, dismissing human warnings about the delicate balance required to keep the star from collapse. Now that star was dying, and 3 billion beings faced extinction as their sun flickered toward darkness. The hegemony's desperate plea for assistance crackled through the static of damaged communication arrays. They needed human stellar engineers to save their worlds, but their pride prevented them from admitting their mistake directly. Instead, they begged for help through intermediaries and back channels, hoping to avoid the humiliation of asking the people they had exiled. Lisa deleted the message without responding. just as she had deleted dozens of similar pleas over the past months. The human exile fleet had strict orders not to intervene in council space, no matter how desperate the situation became. They would not risk their own people to save those who had cast them out, and they would not give the council any excuse to claim that human interference was causing the disasters. The Interspecies Medical Consortium had published its annual report. The previous week, though few people had paid attention to its shocking conclusions. Without human coordinated relief efforts, pandemic responses had become chaotic and ineffective across the galaxy. The Kalari plague had spread to 6 other species, and new diseases were emerging faster than traditional medicine could address. Dr. Shenva had finally succeeded in decoding part of the human research, but the breakthrough had come too late for her own people. The Kalari homeworld was now under permanent quarantine, its population reduced by 80%, and its civilization facing extinction. The cure that had been within reach a year ago remained elusive despite desperate efforts by the galaxy's best medical minds. The report documented similar disasters across hundreds of worlds. Hospital systems designed by human bioengineers were failing for lack of maintenance. Medical training programs established by human doctors had been discontinued as politically suspect. Research facilities that had relied on human coordination were producing increasingly irrelevant results as they lost touch with practical applications. But the medical crisis was only one thread in the tapestry of galactic collapse. The Vorthan homeworld faced mass starvation as their agricultural systems broke down without human-designed irrigation networks. The complex water management systems that had transformed desert planets into gardens required constant adjustment and maintenance that only human engineers understood. When the Vorthan government tried to hire replacement technicians from other species, they discovered that no one else had developed equivalent expertise. The humans had been so generous in sharing their agricultural knowledge that other species had never bothered to develop their own alternatives. Now that generosity had become a curse, leaving entire worlds dependent on technology that no one could maintain. Commander Foster intercepted increasingly frantic communications from across the galaxy as world after world descended into chaos. Crime rates had increased 300% in systems where human peacekeeping missions had been terminated. The humans had not just provided military force, but had also trained local police and established justice systems based on fairness rather than power. Without human guidance, many worlds had reverted to older forms of law enforcement based on tribal loyalty and personal vengeance. Corruption flourished where human oversight had once maintained standards of professional conduct. Civil wars erupted as different factions competed to fill the power vacuum left by departed human administrators. Trade disputes that humans had previously mediated escalated into economic warfare as species competed for diminishing resources. The complex web of interstellar commerce that had enriched the galaxy for decades began to unravel as trust broke down between former partners. Shipping routes that had been peaceful for generations became battlegrounds as species fought to protect their economic interests. Peter Chun sat in his office on Nexus Prime, surrounded by crisis reports that painted a picture of unprecedented disaster. His official duties required him to summarize these reports for the council leadership, but his supervisors continued to demand that he emphasize positive developments while minimizing negative trends. The result was a series of documents that bore little resemblance to reality. The truth was becoming impossible to hide. 17 different humanitarian crises that had been managed by human organizations now raged unchecked across the galaxy. Environmental disasters that human terraforming teams could have easily prevented were turning habitable worlds into lifeless rocks. Species that had lived in peace for centuries were now at each other's throats as old grievances resurfaced without human mediators to keep them in check. Peter's private files contained detailed analysis of each disaster, tracing their origins back to the moment when human assistance had been withdrawn. The pattern was so clear that even his wife Zerano was beginning to notice the problems, though she still refused to connect them to the human exodus. She blamed the chaos on residual effects of human interference, claiming that it would take time for the galaxy to heal from their disruptive influence. The Council's artificial intelligence system Aria had been conducting its own analysis of galactic trends, though its conclusions were classified at the highest levels of government. The AI's cold logic had identified the correlation between human departure and systemic collapse, but its reports were filed away, unread by leaders who preferred comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths. Ambassador Rick Stone received his first official communication from the Council in over a year while the ship drifted in the vast emptiness between galaxies. The message had been routed through 7 different intermediaries to avoid appearing as a direct request for help, but its meaning was clear. The Council wanted humanitarian aid, medical assistance, and technical expertise to address the growing list of crises in their territory. Stone read the message twice to make sure he understood its contents correctly. The same council that had expelled humanity for being too interfering now wanted human interference to save them from the consequences of their decision. The same leaders who had celebrated the end of human contamination now begged for human assistance to clean up the mess they had created. The message offered compensation for human services and vague promises of improved relations in the future. It spoke of temporary cooperation to address mutual concerns and suggested that past disagreements could be set aside in the face of current emergencies. But it never mentioned the possibility of readmitting humans to the galactic community or acknowledging that the expulsion had been a mistake. Stone showed the message to his senior staff and watched their faces harden with anger and disgust. These people had lost their homes, their careers, and their life's work because the Council had decided they were unwelcome. They had watched from exile as the galaxy burned, forbidden to help despite their expertise and willingness to serve. Now they were being asked to risk their lives to save the same people who had cast them out. The vote was unanimous. The message was deleted without a response, just as dozens of similar pleas had been deleted over the past months. The human exile fleet would not be drawn back into the Council's web of lies and betrayal. They had learned the hard way that gratitude was a fleeting emotion and that no good deed went unpunished in galactic politics. On the bridge of his command ship, Admiral Chris Bennett watched the star's wheel slowly overhead and felt the weight of billions of lives on his shoulders. The humans could save the galaxy if they chose to intervene, but they would not sacrifice their dignity or their principles to do so. The Council had made its choice when it expelled them, and now it would have to live with the consequences. Galaxy was vast and full of wonders, and somewhere among those distant stars were people who would welcome human friendship and cooperation. The exiles would find new homes and build new lives far from the chaos that the Council had created. They would not look back with regret, and they would not answer calls for help from those who had rejected their friendship. 18 months after the Great Exodus, Counselor Thexke sat alone in his private chambers, staring at casualty reports that painted the walls of his office in blood and shame. The numbers were beyond anything the galaxy had seen and recorded. History. 400 million beings dead from conflicts, diseases, and disasters that human intervention had once prevented or minimized with routine efficiency. The Kalari species faced complete extinction within 6 months. Their plague-ravaged homeworld was now a monument to the folly of pride, its cities empty except for the dying and the dead. The cure that had been within reach 18 months ago remained locked in computer files that the galaxy's best scientists could not decode, like a treasure chest whose key had been thrown into an ocean of stars. The Vorthan civilization had collapsed into feuding city-states as mass. Starvation drove desperate people to war against their neighbors. The agricultural paradise that human engineers had created from a barren desert was reverting to sand and stone as the irrigation systems failed one by one. Children who had never known hunger were learning its bitter taste as the garden worlds withered and died. 3 entire star systems had been abandoned as environmental disasters consumed their planets like a plague of destruction. The terraforming technology that humans had freely shared required constant maintenance and adjustment that no other species had bothered to learn. Without human expertise, the delicate balance between atmosphere and ecosystem collapsed with devastating speed. Vexca had been one of the strongest voices calling for human expulsion, convinced that their interference weakened the natural order of galactic civilization. He had celebrated their departure as a victory for traditional values and established authority. Now he wondered if he had condemned billions of innocent beings to death for the crime of accepting human help, the Council's own artificial intelligence. System Aria had finally been permitted to present its complete analysis of the crisis to the leadership. The findings were damning beyond anything the assembled representatives had imagined possible. In the 50 years before human contact, the galaxy had averaged 23 major conflicts per year, with a 67% rate of escalation to system-wide warfare. During the 40 years of human participation in galactic affairs, those numbers had dropped to 7 major conflicts per year with only a 12% escalation rate. Interspecies cooperation had reached historic highs as human diplomats taught other species to see their neighbors as partners rather than threats. Trade flourished, science advanced, and quality of life improved across hundreds of worlds. Aria's projection was even more devastating. The artificial intelligence calculated that human activities had prevented an estimated 2.3 billion deaths through medical aid, disaster relief, conflict mediation, and technological assistance. Their freely shared knowledge had elevated entire civilizations from poverty and ignorance to prosperity and enlightenment. The AI's final conclusion struck like a knife through the heart of every council member who heard it. The removal of human influence represented the single greatest humanitarian catastrophe in recorded galactic history, dwarfing the ancient wars and plagues that had shaped the evolution of interstellar civilization. The Council had not saved the galaxy from human contamination. They had murdered it with their own hands. Council Prime Vextal authorized a secret mission to locate the human exile fleet and negotiate their return before the disaster became irreversible. The mission was given unlimited resources and authority to make whatever promises were necessary to secure human cooperation. Pride was a luxury that the dying galaxy could no longer afford. The ship chosen for this desperate mission was commanded by Captain Amy Roberts, one of the few humans who had chosen exile rather than abandon her principles to remain in Council space. Her knowledge of human psychology and culture made her the obvious choice to lead the negotiation team, though she accepted the assignment with obvious reluctance. Roberts had lost everything when the humans were expelled. Her husband had been killed in the Civil War on Proxima 7 while trying to evacuate human civilians. Her children had died in the plague that swept through the refugee camps before the exile fleet could establish proper medical facilities. She had every reason to hate the Council and no reason to help them escape the consequences of their actions. The Council ship arrived at the coordinates that Aria had calculated based on human fleet movements and gravitational anomalies. The location was deep in the void between galaxies, where ancient stars died in lonely silence and space itself seemed to mourn the tragedies of civilized worlds. But when they dropped out of hyperspace, they found only the cold emptiness of vacuum and a single message, buoy floating like a tombstone in the darkness. The recording inside the buoy was brief and spoken in the calm, measured tones that humans used when delivering final judgments. Admiral Chris Bennett appeared on the screen, his weathered face showing no trace of anger or satisfaction. Only the quiet dignity of a man who had seen too much suffering to waste time on hatred. To the Galactic Council, Bennett began his words carrying across the void like an epitaph for a dying civilization. We offered our hand in friendship, our knowledge in service, and our lives in protection of all sentient beings. You chose fear over hope, suspicion over trust, pride over wisdom. We do not abandon our principles because you have abandoned yours. The Admiral paused, and for a moment the only sound was the gentle hum of the ship's life support systems struggling against the cosmic silence. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of an entire species' disappointment and resolve. The galaxy is vast, and there are many who still welcome those who come in peace. We have found new friends among the stars, people who value cooperation over domination and wisdom over tradition. We will build something better with them, something worthy of the dreams that brought us to the stars in the first place. Bennett's image flickered slightly as the ancient recording medium struggled against the radiation of deep space. Do not look for us again, he said with finality. We have learned that some wounds cut too deep for healing, and some bridges burn too completely for rebuilding. You made your choice when you cast us out, and we have made ours by choosing to move forward rather than look back. The transmission ended with coordinates that led not to the human fleet, but to a detailed record of every humanitarian crisis that had occurred since the Exodus. Medical disasters that could have been prevented, environmental catastrophes that could have been avoided, wars that could have been stopped before they began. It was a catalogue of consequences, a precise accounting of the price the galaxy had paid for its fear of human influence. Captain Roberts stared at the empty screen long after the message ended, feeling the weight of what had been lost and what could never be recovered. The humans were gone, not just from council space, but from the galaxy itself. They had found new homes among distant stars, where their gifts would be welcomed rather than feared, their friendship cherished rather than rejected. The journey back to council space was conducted in silence, each member of the delegation lost in thoughts too dark for words. They carried with them the knowledge that they had failed not just in their mission, but in their most basic responsibility to protect the innocent beings under their care. The council had murdered billions through pride and ignorance, and now they would have to face the consequences alone. Counselor Thexka received the report of the mission's failure, while standing in the observation deck of Nexus Prime, watching the stars that had once seemed so bright and welcoming. The galaxy stretched endlessly before him, but it felt smaller now, diminished by the absence of those who had given it meaning and hope. The humans had been the galaxy's conscience, and now that conscience was gone forever. The council chambers had grown quieter in recent months as representatives from dying worlds stopped attending sessions. The Kalari delegate had been the first to disappear, followed by others whose people faced extinction or collapse. The great hall that had once buzzed with the voices of 200 species now echoed with the words of fewer than half that number. Aria's voice filled the empty chamber one final time, its electronic tones carrying a question that would haunt the survivors of galactic civilization for generations to come. Query: how does one apologize to the stars themselves? The artificial intelligence had reached the same conclusion that every thinking being in the galaxy would eventually reach. Some mistakes were too vast for forgiveness, too complete for redemption. The council had not just expelled a troublesome species. They had torn the heart out of galactic civilization and watched it bleed to death in the darkness between stars. Peter Chun sat in his empty office, surrounded by crisis reports that no one would read and casualty figures that no one wanted to acknowledge. His wife had finally left him, unable to bear his growing despair over problems she refused to understand. The galaxy was dying around them, but she preferred to believe that everything would return to normal if they just waited long enough.